Hi there, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our Western webinar on disease management for Western Australian crops. This webinar is looking at practical tactics for the 2026 season, and we're thrilled to have you joining us today. This webinar is being delivered by the Disease Management Extension Network, which is a GRDC investment. And we're really thrilled to be able to offer this webinar to you. We had a lot of feedback from around the West that having a webinar would be really handy at this point in season. So thank you everyone for joining us today and also for submitting your questions through the registration process. We were really thrilled with a lot of the questions that came through, and we've made sure our team have designed their presentations based on the questions you asked. So hopefully we'll be providing a lot of relevant content for you. So as far as the day goes, we will start with a current seasonal disease update for Western Australia, and we will have Geoff Thomas and Andrea Hills here from DPIRD in WA, followed by fungicide resistance in wheat powdery mildew with Nola D'Souza and canola disease management with Angela van der Wel. All our speakers will be covering making better in-crop disease management decisions, looking at fungicide timing, crop risk, and protecting yield. We'll also consider disease management tactics. Following an update by our speakers, we will open up for a Q&A with our disease experts. I've got a number of questions which came through via the registration process, but we'll also take questions from the chat. And on to the chat, if we just move into our housekeeping. So a reminder that we have a large number of people who are registered to join today's webinar. So everyone should be on mute and cameras will remain off. So just a reminder, we are recording. We've actually found the recording to be a really handy resource for others who can't attend today. So we'll make this recording available to people afterwards. For those who'd like to ask a question, we ask you to please type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will reply to these directly via the Q&A box, or we'll put them to the panel of experts following their presentations. We have allowed some time at the end of the workshop for Q&A, so we look forward to hearing your questions then too. If you're having any issues with audio, we suggest you please leave the webinar and try rejoining because that can often sort out any of those hiccups. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our DMEN, don't you love a good acronym, our project to you. So the DMEN project is a GRDC investment, and it actually stands for the Disease Management Extension Network. It actually builds on the successful AFRIN project, which was all about fungicide resistance. This new GRDC investment brings together disease management, research and extension across all major grain crop diseases and soil-borne pathogens. And you'll see this is our awesome team here. We're minus a few in that image, but it gives you an insight into how large our disease management network is across Australia. I would just like to give a shout out to GRDC as it is one of their investments. Also to the team from Ag Communicators, Ag Consulting Co, Adelaide Uni, AgVic, the Centre for Crop and Disease Management at Curtin Uni, the New South Wales Government, Queensland Government, the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, so DPIRD WA, FAR Australia, Marcroft Grains Pathology, the University of Southern Queensland and SARDI in South Australia. So our goal is to increase the adoption of fungicide resistance and disease management strategies to reduce the emergence and impact of fungicide resistance and key diseases. So just a friendly reminder that in this webinar, we are working to provide you with the best information that we can, but just note our disclaimer down the bottom that we suggest that you seek your own advice, which is relevant to your own farming system and business. But we will do our best possible to give you all the information that you need. And we will provide a follow-up note after the webinar directing you to some of the DMEN resources which may help you post-workshop. So without further ado, that's my housekeeping for today. And I would just like to introduce our 4 speakers up front. I've got a very short bio. We've chosen to keep these short for today, given our time. So I'll just introduce you to the 4 speakers. Hello, Nola. So Dr. Nola D'Souza is with the Centre for Crop and Disease Management at Curtin University. She is a research associate at CCDM and combines expertise in plant pathology and fungicide resistance research with a strong focus on extension, helping growers and advisors adopt best practice fungicide resistance management. And then I'll introduce Geoff Thomas from DPIRD WA. Hello, Geoff. And Geoff is a principal research scientist with DPIRD WA. His research focuses on cereal and pulse diseases, integrated disease management, and delivering practical disease management solutions for grain growers. I'd now like to introduce Andrea Hills from DPIRD WA. Andrea is a senior research scientist with DPIRD WA. She specialises in crop disease management with a focus on cereal, canola and pulse diseases and works closely with growers to improve disease identification and management. And our other speaker of the day is Dr. Angela van der Wel with the University of Melbourne and Marcroft Grains Pathology. So hi there, Ange. Ange is a plant pathologist with the University of Melbourne and Marcroft Grains. Her research focuses on canola diseases, fungicide resistance and practical disease management strategies for Australian growers. So we're thrilled to bring the team to you together today for this webinar. And I'd now like to kick things off with the current seasonal disease update for WA, and Andrea and Geoff will share this session. So it's over to you, team.
Thanks a lot, Belinda. If we just move forward. Welcome along, everybody. Just very briefly, I'm going to just introduce the season, talk a little bit about generalities, and then Andrea is going to dive into some specific disease issues. Obviously, for disease to occur, we need a host, we need a pathogen, and we need an environment that is favourable. And most presentations like this start with a few maps from the BOM. And just having a look at this season, as all seasons presents challenges, and this is just a general look. Regions will have specific issues, but obviously we started with a bit of subsoil moisture, but we've had a couple of really dry spells through May, and then particularly through July, which has been dry and a little bit warm. And what that means is that we actually have crops with a range of growth stages, crops that are varying in how they look, but there are a number of very healthy and very advanced crops at this time of year. The other thing that to note in here is this is the fact that we've had these dry spells, and these dry spells have a particular impact on, I guess, things like our necrotrophic diseases, our stubble-borne diseases, and sort of delay their onset. And so certainly the dryish period through May maybe meant that some of our net blotches and scald and things like that didn't get going. And certainly the recent July dry period has really allowed plants potentially to jump ahead of some of the disease that we might normally expect to see. So if we move along and have a quick look at what happened last year, just a couple of things that came out of last year that maybe made us think that what might happen this year. Obviously, everybody in the south wanted to talk about scald, barley scald last year, a bit of a expanded virulence for that disease. We saw a little bit of a change response in powdery mildew in barley, and Andrea will talk a little bit about that. And obviously, there's been a bit of discussion around loose smut, both in terms of some varieties, something like Neo, that seems to be expressing it quite significantly and maybe in slightly different ways with some leaf symptoms, but also the detection of some mutations which might result in some reduced sensitivity to some fungicide actives. In wheat, Nola's obviously going to talk about reduced sensitivity to fungicides there. We're not going to talk about take all today, but you can see down on the bottom right of those photos, last year had a fair bit of take all around, which I'm just pointing out because it was pretty cool if you're a plant pathologist. And then obviously we're in a situation now where in the high and medium rainfall zones, most years broadleaf crops are at risk from sclerotinia. So if we move on and talk about, this webinar is pretty timely, I guess. It's the time of year when crops have reached or are approaching those important growth stages. So in terms of cereals, we're sort of stem extension through to flag leaf, and in some cases we're at awn, peep and head emergence. And so those are the times when all of those upper canopy leaves are all out, and we're looking to protect those leaves, maintain green leaf area. In things like canola, lupins and legumes, we are at those flowering stages, which might be the optimum time for application for something like sclerotinia. Obviously, that late winter and into spring, as the weather warms slightly and we still have those rain events, that's the time when we see many diseases kicking off. So you'll see certainly diseases like nodorum in wheat or septoria blotch in oats will take off to a degree in that spring period. But given what I just said about crop growth stages, it is important to match your crop growth stage to the seasonal conditions and the disease profile. Certainly, 2-3 weeks ago, there were calls around, or even more than that, there were calls around early sown canola that was actually at 50% flowering. But the concern, rightly so, was that actually there wasn't actually any risk from any diseases. And so there wasn't a need to apply fungicide in that circumstance. Just quickly, what diseases have we seen? Andrea is going to talk about barley leaf rust on the south coast in the Esperance region. That's one that's popped up out of the box. Some discussion about powdery mildew from Andrea and Nola. And then I guess Ange is obviously going to touch a lot on fungal diseases of canola. We've seen a few discussions. If you've been looking at PestVac's newsletter, you will have seen Ben Congdon talking about turnip yellows in canola. Don't think it's been as bad here in Western Australia as maybe the eastern states, but certainly it is something that we have been aware of, probably moving out of the danger period for that disease now. So as I don't take too much time, we should probably just move along. I wanted to briefly point out, and I know this is looking into the future and modelling, but the modelling is for something to bear in mind is that the outlook is for a warmer and drier late winter into spring, which obviously has implications for grain fill, but also has implications for many of our diseases in that that's not the favourable conditions. So we might be moving into conditions that actually aren't as favourable for some of our foliar diseases, and certainly something to bear in mind in terms of, do I need to put a fungicide on? Is the disease risk as high that necessitates that? And certainly some of those necrotrophs might, after the dry July, some of those necrotrophs may just never catch up in terms of getting to the top of the canopy. The one thing that I wanted to point out, if we move forward, is that the other thing to bear in mind is that not everything is actually a disease. Just because there's a blemish or a spot on a leaf, it's not actually a disease. And if the pictures to the left, yes, we've probably moved past that now, but certainly we had a lot of calls at the start of the year about herbicide damage, concern about whether it was barley scald. So it is important that we make sure that what we're trying to respond to is actually disease and not some physiological or abiotic impact like the boron tox in the barley on the right-hand side. And there's a couple more examples on the next slide, which are in wheat. So we have small spots, necrosis from environmental damage, pollen scorch, pseudo-black chaff causing blackening on the stem. All of these things can mimic disease without actually being disease and will not respond to fungicide. And generally speaking, in wheat, our variety spectrum is pretty good for the necrotrophic diseases. So we need to be certain about that disease to make sure that we're actually spraying for something that is disease. I think I'll move on to Andrea now to hone in on a couple of those important diseases.
Thanks, Geoff. So we're going to cover off on some of these diseases that you can see below: leaf smut scald, mildew and leaf rust. So we'll start off with the barley leaf rust, and this is a disease that isn't unusual to see when we go out doing our surveillance towards the end of the year and at low levels in the crop and well past a point where it can do any damage or need control. But this season, especially in the southeast, we've had reports and seen leaf rust in crops since June, because some of the varieties of seedlings are quite susceptible, and conditions are obviously right for it. Leaf rust is of concern to us because in terms of yield loss potential, it is probably the worst of the diseases that we look at for yield and for quality, especially in those, well, we don't have any SBS varieties anymore, but in susceptible varieties, we want to keep an eye on it. So this is because rust is a disease that cycles really quickly, produces a lot of spores, it's wind-blown, it doesn't need quite as much moisture as a lot of other diseases. So even though it says infections promoted by sort of up to 20 degrees, it will keep going past that. That's just the optimal sort of range that we see. So in spring, it can keep moving and move quickly on susceptible varieties. And most of the varieties currently being grown in WA are susceptible. You know, that includes Maximus, Commodus, Cyclops, Buff. So we need to monitor it, monitor those susceptible varieties and protect the upper leaves if rust is present in your crop, or if you're getting reports that it's all around you, and that's where PestFacts newsletter can be pretty handy to keep an ear to the ground in terms of what's happening in the district. Okay, so here's some trial results from 2009 during the last barley leaf rust outbreak. This is in Bodan barley, which was very susceptible to barley leaf rust. And this graph shows disease infection in the blue bars. You can see that the average amount of disease on the flag -1 and the flag -2, well, it was basically at 100% infection. And the diamonds in the sort of reddy colour are grain yield. So here down the bottom, we've got a variety of fungicides that were applied to the trial here. Untreated, a baytan seed dressing was also used, and that just basically shows that it's pretty ineffective. And then you can see this was followed up with 2 applications of foliar fungicide. This is all fungicide resistance popping up in WA. So, you know, there were treatments here that we wouldn't use or ever recommend in crop for you to do, such as 2 tebuconazoles in a row, 2 propiconazoles. Here's Teb plus prothioconazole. Tilt Extra was a mix of propiconazole and ciproconazole, and Amistar Extra, which is still around and reasonably popular, is azoxystrobin and ciproconazole. So you can see in this trial the leaf rust was controlled with these well-timed sprays, and the yield response was pretty significant. So it went from something like 2.7 tonne up to 3.8. So that's over a tonne, and a significant proportion of your grain yield and improved quality as well. Now, this trial and the next one I'm going to show you were done by my colleague Keith Jayasena in Albany. So the next trial is also in the South Stirling, where Keith's work, and he assessed the barley leaf rust on the top 2 leaves, and this trial was a little lower but still very severe in this untreated bar at the beginning here of the graph. you can see that all the whole crop actually had a tillering spray of tebuconazole, and then we've come back, or Keith has come back and put these treatments over the top. You can see that a single spray applied at Z39 or flag leaf emerged had significantly reduced the amount of rust on the leaves in the blue bars or blue columns and increased the yield, in this case by around 800 kilos per hectare. So these two trials are just examples of if you do have leaf rust in a really susceptible variety or even a susceptible one, it's well worth applying your fungicide once it starts moving, if it is present and moving up the canopy, to ensure you've got that good protection on those upper leaves. Okay, barley scald is the next disease we'll have a bit of a look at. Unlike barley leaf rust, scald is a stubble-borne disease, and it can also be transmitted in the grain, which is why we sometimes see it starting off as hotspots in paddocks. The fun thing with scald, or the challenging thing I should really say, is that there are multiple pathotypes or multiple strains in WA at the moment, and collectively they can attack just about the full range of our varieties, but not all pathotypes or strains are present in all regions of WA. For instance, Maximus in the central area is basically susceptible to the scald strain that dominates in that region. In my own area, in Esperance District, Maximus is holding up fine. Our scald strain is a different one. But in other areas, there are definitely a mixture. In South Stirling's, for instance, there has been a nasty neo-attacking strain present, and that has also moved up into, say, the Great Southern. So this is really quite a challenging situation, because whilst a crop or a variety of barley such as Neo, which is rated moderately resistant to moderately susceptible, it's not unusual to find the odd spot of scald here or there. And in that situation, don't panic. Just monitor it as you would for other diseases, and standard fungicide timings will be able to manage that level of disease. But where you're seeing widespread infection across your crop, you're not expecting it in that variety, you really need to then say, aha, I wonder what if this is one example of one of those strains that can attack my variety. I need to protect those upper leaves. I need to be a little bit on the ball in terms of getting them on so that the flag -1 in particular is protected. Okay. Now, I also wanted to point out, just the colour of these scald lesions here. On the right, you can see the early lesions are that bluey, greyy green, big ruffed diamonds on those leaves, and as they age, they go very pale and get a very dark margin. So if you're seeing just the older lesions and they're at the bottom of your canopy, that's probably a good sign. It means perhaps the conditions aren't so good. Scald does tend to be more of a wet weather or wet area disease. But if you're seeing a lot of that sort of bluey-green ones as well as the older ones, it means the disease is still active, okay? It's still moving. We do need rain to move the scald as well, from plant to plant and further up the canopy. largely the spores produced in these, and that the spores produced in these lesions are spread by that rain splash. So if the spring is fairly dry, the progression up the canopy will be a lot less than it would be if we're still getting really hard rain coming through. Thanks, Nola. Well, Bridget. So the scald can have major yield impacts, and this is a trial that my colleague Jason Bradley did in Lake Grace in 2024. So this was actually designed to be a spot form net blotch trial, but scald turned up. And on the left axis here, you can see we have grain yield. At the bottom, you can see we've got the 3 varieties, Spartacus, Maximus, and Neo. So in the central region, that strain of scald had no effect or very little effect on Neo, as we might expect from a variety rated MRMS. But Maximus and Spartacus, there was a reasonable amount of disease present there, especially in those untreated blue bars, blue columns, I should say. And when a foliar fungicide was applied, we did recover some grain yield, and the Sustiva plus a foliar fungicide treatment was quite effective in recovering even more. So this is just to highlight that scald is probably not quite as nasty as barley leaf rust, but it is still very significant. It's probably equivalent to net form, net blotch in its damage, so it's not to be taken lightly. Thanks, Bridget. If we turn to the net blotches now, basically spot form net blotch has declined in dominance in the higher rainfall regions, but in the medium and low rainfall areas, especially if barley on barley rotations are being followed, it can be significant. However, we tend not to get regular grain yield responses to fungicide use if the yield potential is less than 3 tonne. And in the low rainfall, we struggle to get any consistent yield response in the trials, in the dozens of trials that we have done. In terms of net form, net blotch, the silver lining to potentially having a drier spring is that net form should hopefully slow down a bit. The very aggressive strains that were present attacking Planet, Atlantis, and Spinnaker have really dropped off in dominance since Planet has largely been eliminated from many farming systems, but it's still reasonably present in medium to high rainfall. It bears monitoring basically to keep those upper leaves, that F-1, clean. So the last disease, one more disease I think we'll cover is the barley powdery mildew. There you go. So what we've seen in barley powdery mildew is a change in the strains that are present in WA. We've known that they are there or changing for the last couple of years. And as we grow more Maximus and Combat, we're seeing a little bit more of mildew around. So it's reduced their variety resistance, basically. But they're still not a completely susceptible crop, and it's quite manageable with normal applications for those areas. And in terms of impact, mildews generally have the lowest response to fungicide. So don't necessarily rush out and think that you will have to spray. It's a case-by-case situation. Barley loose smut, as Geoff alluded to, we saw a lot in the last couple of years. So we know that the variety differences are out there. And again, silver lining to this dry spring might be that we get to reduce the amount of smut present in our grain in the high rainfall. If you get to a point where the smut in your variety is more than sort of 5% of the plants being infected or the grain being infected, you might choose to look for a cleaner source to try and start again. You can get seed testing through the DPIRD diagnostic laboratory service. They will evaluate your seed for next year or any potential seed you're thinking of buying for a feed. And then it's down to seed dressing fungicides to manage loose smut. And DPIRD also have a project looking at loose smut in more detail, and hopefully you'll be hearing more about the results from that in the next few months and year. So lastly, we will go on to wheat powdery mildew. So we're seeing these diseases in wheat mildew, yellow spot nodorum. They are just starting up now. Gloom blotch will come. Well, some people have got wheat heads well and truly out of the boot now, and that is worth monitoring. It's worth mentioning that gloom blotch resistance is different to that of the leaves. So check your variety sowing guide for your variety to see how risky or if there is any risk at all for your variety this season. In terms of wheat powdery mildew, this is another disease that cycles very quickly, and some areas along the south coast are just conducive to the disease. So in those sorts of areas, the best form of control is variety, although I know that a lot of people are sticking with Scepter because of the yield advantage, but I commend those that are trialling other diseases, trialling other varieties, I should say, to get to lower the overall disease pressure, not just for yourself, but also in a district sense. It does make a difference. So fungicide use is geared around protecting the upper leaves, and Nola's going to talk a bit more now about the resistance situation for powdery mildew in wheat in WA. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea. Nola, we will hand straight over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Belinda. Thanks, Andrea and Geoff. Some good diseases happening at the moment, which is always great for us pathologists. But for you, not so much. I just wanted to concentrate today, though, on fungicide resistance in wheat powdery mildew and how that's starting to become an emerging issue here in WA. Can I just get the next slide, please? So just for a quick start off, as Andrea has already spoken about, wheat powdery mildew likes nice, cool environmental conditions, 18 to 23. It likes extended wetness and high 70% or over humidity. Now, those things are very common for the high rainfall zones, so most likely to be occurring there, but can also happen in the medium and the low rainfall zones. Though by the sounds of it from Geoff, if we're going to have a warm, dry finish this year, may not be an issue this year at all. Also, as Andrea said, it has a rapid life cycle. So the latent period is only 7 days, 5 to 7 days, which means that a single spore, when it lands on a leaf, will actually then grow and produce more of these spores, like you can see here on the screen, within a week. And these, up in the top right-hand corner there, you can see a single spore has caused this tiny little colony of lots of fluffy little probably strings, and each of those strings is actually a whole heap of spores attached to each other, and when the wind blows they all break off. So you can see how one single spore can cause hundreds of thousands of spores to be available and wind blown throughout the district. It also survives in stubble, and it proliferates from the weeds and the green bridges that are left around. Now, fungicide resistance, next slide, Bridget, thank you, is very widespread over in the east. So I wanted to talk to you about how that developed and how that evolved and how that may be a good warning for us here in the west. Next slide, Bridget. So DMI fungicide resistance in wheat powdery mildew was first discovered in New South Wales and in Tasmania back in 2015. Now, this was a mutation called F136, which affects all of the group 3 DMI azoles to different degrees. So things such as your propiconazoles, tebuconazoles, bethioconazoles. Now, this was called a gateway mutation. So by itself, the actual mutation didn't cause any field failure within the field, but it is the start of basically a whole heap of mutations that might occur afterwards that can actually result in field failure of your fungicides. So at this point in 2015, this was when we widely told everyone about this mutation discovery, just to give them an early warning, to let them know that this is what's happening, this is there, and if you manage your fungicide resistance, the chances are that it won't have a massive impact. Next slide. Unfortunately, with the continued use of the cheap and available DMIs, this gateway mutation actually spread throughout the eastern states, and within 5 years we had widespread DMI resistance outbreaks throughout the eastern states areas. Next slide. And this was also coincided with QOI fungicide resistance. Now, QOI resistance, the actual point from actually detecting this mutation up until the first resistance outbreaks was only a single year. And that's because the mutations for QOI resistance in wheat powdery mildew is a single mutation that gives you resistance to all of the actives within the group 11 QOI group. Now, those resistance outbreaks became so widespread right up until 2020. And by 2022, with having severe wheat powdery mildew fungicide resistance to both the DMIs and the QOIs, the APVMA had to issue emergency permits for mildew-specific fungicides. So these were the group 50 metrophenones and the 13 quinoxaphene and proquinazids. So these fungicides are actually mildew-specific, so they couldn't be used for anything else. But the idea was that they could use these to get on top of the disease, reduce the disease incidence, and hopefully get more, I suppose, fungicide resistance practices in place to reduce that disease and reduce the incidence of fungicide resistance. But still, we're finding frequent outbreaks of DMI and QOI resistance, and unfortunately, not getting on top of it over in the eastern states till now. So the APVMA has had to extend those emergency permits up until 2027. Next slide. So what's happening here in WA? So back in 2015, you can see by these yellow hexagons on the map here that we did some extensive testing, well, not extensive, but very broad testing around the southwest and in the growing areas, and we didn't detect any DMI or QOI resistance back then. Next slide. And then in 2020, when it was ramping up over in the eastern states, again, we were checking some of our high rainfall zone areas and also not detecting anything. Next slide. Then, unfortunately, in 2024, Andrea down in the Esperance area, they were noticing there was maybe some reduced sensitivity happening and something wasn't quite right. So they sent us in some samples and we did detect the first incidence of that gateway mutation, the same one they found in the eastern states before it ramped up, around the Esperance region in 2024. Then in 2025, again, we can see we've had extensive testing around the growing areas, and we can now see that this gateway mutation is also spreading into the Albany region and even north up into Muresk and Wongan Hills. We found some samples with that F136 mutation detected. Next slide. Luckily, 2025, as part of that, because we're very aware that QOI resistance spread really fast over in the eastern states. We did extensive testing for QOI resistance last year, and you can see across the state there, everything is still sensitive. So we do not have QOI resistance in WA, which is a good thing. Next slide. So this is a real window of opportunity for all the growers in our regions here in WA, for us to take advantage of knowing that what we have there is a gateway mutation that may be just starting to show some reduced sensitivity out in the regions, but something that we can get on top of and something that we can control, so that all of those red dots that you see over there in the eastern states don't migrate over here to WA. So what can we do about it? So controlling fungicide resistance in wheat powdery mildew, you need to start at the beginning of season. I know we're midway through, but these first couple of fungicide resistance 5 I'm going to talk to you about, keep them in mind definitely for next year. Number one, as Andrea said, the best resistance is to have your resistant varieties out there to wheat powdery mildew. And remember to rotate those as well, because you don't want to be missing out. You don't want to be breaking down your varietal resistance as well. Bridget? Now, unfortunately, you'll see there's not a lot of resistance to wheat powdery mildew. These are from the 2026 crop sowing guide. And more than 50% last year was planted to something like Septa or Vixen, which were susceptible to severely susceptible. And we want to try and reduce that. So if you can mix in some of your moderately susceptible varieties and also your Brumby, which is resistant, that's going to be reducing the disease pressure throughout your district. And so giving you a good start to the beginning of the season. Next. Number 2 and 3. So these are real basic stuff that you can do that don't involve fungicides. Rotate your crops and use time and distance to reduce that disease carryover. And use all your non-chemical control methods to reduce that disease pressure as well. So no-brainer, don't plant wheat on wheat. If you're sticking wheat into last year's stubble, which has powdery mildew already there, you're going to be on the back foot right from the beginning of the season. So reduce your stubble as well. Remove those weeds and your green bridges at least 4 weeks prior to sowing, so that the powdery mildew can't be spread easily to your new seedlings coming out of the ground. Also consider your time of sowing. Early sown wheat can put that high disease pressure being in the same time as your wheat is growing through it. So you want to try and reduce that if you can. Also, because it likes a lot of humidity, wheat powdery mildew can hide under leaf canopies where it's really dense. So if you can optimize your nitrogen inputs to reduce that canopy density, or maybe even consider grazing or increasing distance between the rows, you can reduce that leaf canopy density and reduce that humidity, and hopefully also allow, when you do want to go in and spray, for that fungicide to be able to reach the bottom leaves and into the canopy where it's going to do its thing. Next one. Number 4, we really want you to limit fungicide use in general. So this is coming up in now where you're probably, if you've got diseases out there, you want to start using your fungicides. But if you can limit your fungicide use just in general, specifically those group 3 fungicides where we do have the mutations quite widely spread in our growing areas, that will reduce the fungicide selection pressure on the wheat powdery mildew. So hopefully it doesn't become a lot more resistant, and then we'll see those that resulting in resistant outbreaks in your field. So we want you to go out there and scout your crops for that disease. Make sure that you've got it there. Don't just go on and prophylactically spray everything, because you're increasing that fungicide selection pressure. And then check the weather forecast. I mean, Geoff has already showed us that we're probably going up for a warmer, drier finish coming into spring. So you may not even need to actually spray anything at all, because the weather itself is going to keep that disease pressure down and stop it from going up into your higher leaves before harvest. Also, we do like to be on top of powdery mildew. So the first sign of seeing it, because it had that really short latent period where thousands of spores can be released within a week, the first sign that you see of it, then do give it a spray. But remember to keep the limit of that group 3 fungicide use if you can. So that brings us on to our very important 5th fungicide resistant 5. Thanks, Bridget, is to rotate and mix your fungicide groups. So we know that the resistance to the group 3 DMIs, it can be a resistance to all of the actives within that group to varying degrees. So you want to protect them for as long as you can. Bridget? Thank you. So very important to use a different chemical group every time that you go out and spray. So rotate between your group 3s and your group 11s. And also rotate between the different fungicides or the different actives within your group 3 chemical group. So you're not using that same active over and over again, increasing that fungicide selection pressure. Very important as well, use fungicide mixtures so that a mixture can knock out that population as early as possible. So if there's fungicide resistance in there to one group, the other group will knock it out as well and keep that disease pressure down. Also, because we know from the eastern states that the group 11 fungicides are at really high risk of resistance developing, we really recommend that you only use a group 11 fungicide once per season. So really limit those group 11s. And I think that's it from me. Yes, if you want to have any further resources about this or read more about it, then you can easily get that on at www.afrin.com.au, which is transitioning to DMEN. So I'll hand it over now to Angela. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Nola. And straight over to you, Angela.
Thank you. So 2026, we have named blackleg a year of blackleg. Essentially, at least in the east, we are seeing massive amounts of the disease. These are some photos that were taken back in early June to mid-June, which we would never see, A, this level of disease generally, and B, we would definitely not see it that early. And essentially the reason for this is that we have had exceptionally wet and exceptionally dry weather, warm weather over here. So it's just been perfect for disease. But as Geoff said, we always like a good bomb slide. For WA, that has been mixed. Depending on where you are, you have had above average rainfall, above average temperatures, and other regions have been exceptionally dry. So again, as Geoff mentioned, this has then led to a lot of crops that had early establishment because we did have that subsoil moisture, early rainfall in April, and extremely developed crops. So we were over in Esperance a couple of weeks ago, and as Geoff alluded to, there was crops that were well and truly in full bloom, sort of early July, which is just crazy. But the other big thing that it means that our stubble has also matured very early. So blackleg is a stubble-borne disease. And essentially what happens is the stubble needs to stay wet and in coolish temperatures so that the stubble stays moist for multiple days in a row so that the spores can mature. And essentially the conditions that have been around have favoured this. And this is the map here from the Sporicle website, which is from DPIRD, and it shows that for most regions in WA, the stubble had matured by the 1st of June. So this is extremely early. So normally we wouldn't see the stubble being mature and releasing spores until sort of the end of June. So this meant that with every rainfall event from the start of June, you're going to get spores being released from the stubble and then infecting your crops. And as it turns out, there was plenty of wet days in June. So these are some maps from Esperance and from York. So we had multiple days where we had enough moisture that we were getting those rainfall events, making this a very conducive year for blackleg also in WA. And indeed, as I said, when we were over there a couple of weeks ago, we did see plenty of disease. So hence, year of blackleg, probably not quite as extreme in WA, but it means we've been talking a lot about getting out there, monitoring your crops and making decisions around managing the level of disease that you're seeing in your particular field. And that's going to be dependent on a range of different strategies, which I'm going to touch on in a second. The biggest thing though, when talking about managing blackleg is we really need to understand what aspect of the disease we're controlling. So when we talk about blackleg these days, we talk about crown canker, which you can see down here on the left-hand side, upper canopy infection, which is in the middle, and pod infection, which is to your right. So essentially, with every rainfall event, as I said, you get the release of the spores, and it just depends on what developmental stage the plant is at as to which form of the disease you'll get. So if your spores land on your seedlings, then the fungus colonizes the cotyledons or the true leaves, goes down the petioles and into the stem, And then that allows the fungus enough time to grow down there, colonise, and cause crown canker at the end of the year. So when we're talking about controlling crown canker, we're talking about protecting our plants for the first 4 to 6 leaves, so that then you're minimising the amount of disease that you get at the end of the growing season. Any disease that comes in after that, it's too late to cause any significant yield loss from crown canker. However, if you get the spores landing on the upper parts of the plant, such as the flowers and those upper branches, that's when we get our upper canopy infection. So again, as Geoff mentioned, we had very early flowering crops this year. So upper canopy infection is going to be a major issue for blackleg in WA. Then lastly, you've got pod infection. Unfortunately, there's really not much we can do about pod infection. Essentially, again, it's when rainfall events happen during pod fill. You get that infection directly on the pods, which leads to premature shattering, infected seeds, things like that. If you've got effective major gene, that controls pod infection, but other than that, you can't put any control strategies on to minimise the impact of pod infection. So how can we then make decisions about what we need to do with respect to controlling blackleg disease? We know that cultural practices have a massive impact on blackleg disease, and it's simply by reducing the amount of disease pressure. So we've got 4 pictures here. This is canola grown at different distances from last year's canola stubble. You can see there, the top right, that's canola on canola. So we've pretty much had 100% death in our plants when we've put it in that situation. However, when we move out to 500 metres or 1,000 metres or more, then we really minimise the amount of disease that we're getting on our crops, and this has a massive impact on reducing disease and therefore the need to even control blackleg. But as you know, WA, you really are pushing the limits when it comes to canola, and we appreciate that that has completely removed this as a strategy for controlling blackleg. But keep in mind, if we do destroy our fungicides and we do destroy our genetics, then cultural practices is going to be the only thing you have left. And it means you will have to go back into those 1 and 4 year rotations, which means we really need to be thinking about our genetics and our fungicides very, very carefully. So genetics is the best way you can control blackleg. If you have effective major gene, you will see no disease. So up here in the top pictures of the cotyledons, if we have effective major gene, which is on the right, you'll see that the fungus is completely stopped. So it gets into the plant switches on its defense mechanisms. It then can't cause any colonisation within the crown, and you get no disease, which you can see underneath it. If you don't have effective major gene, then the amount of disease will depend on whether or not you have quantitative resistance. So that's essentially a backup type of resistance. And a lot of our cultivars do have both major gene and quantitative resistance. And a lot of our varieties now are really reliant on that quantitative resistance because the major gene has been overcome. So it's really essential for you to understand what resistance you are growing in your paddocks, how effective it is by monitoring, and then determining whether or not you need to rotate resistance because you're starting to see higher levels of disease. When it comes to the major genes, we have all of the cultivars are classified into resistance groups, and the effectiveness of these resistance groups are monitored across the country and provided to you in the blackleg management guide. So for WA, you can see down here, your D, F, H and S's are quite effective in a lot of regions, whereas in some of the other regions, you don't have as many choices. Essentially, if you are growing a cultivar that only has A, B or C resistance, then you are really reliant on that quantitative resistance, so that backup. You don't have effective major gene. If you're growing D, F, H or S, it will depend on how long you've been growing a variety as to whether or not those resistance genes are effective. And I'll come back to that again in a second. When it comes to quantitative resistance, it is a very good type of resistance because it obviously stops the plant from getting completely colonised, and that is where yield loss occurs. However, how well it works is dependent on the amount of disease pressure you have in your region. So if you are in a high disease pressure situation, such as a wheat canola wheat rotation, you're right beside next year's canola stubble, then you really need to be growing cultivars that are R or RMR rated. If you're growing at MR or below, then you're going to always get enough disease that you are going to see some sort of yield loss. And that's simply because the disease pressure is too much for the quantitative resistance to have a good impact on. But as you decrease your disease pressure through either isolation from stubble or your rotation strategies, then obviously this opens up which level of resistance that you can grow. So if you're in a low rainfall region, low disease pressure region, essentially you can grow any variety because the disease pressure is so low that you really aren't going to see any yield loss from blackleg. Now, whilst genetic resistance is the bee's knees and will give you the best control of blackleg, unfortunately it can be overcome and or eroded. And this is a situation that we are seeing in 2026, which is added to the issues of the seasons being so conducive to blackleg. So if you've got major gene, as I said, it's an all or nothing response. You won't get any leaf lesions, you won't get any upper canopy, and you won't get any crown canker. However, if you grow the same variety for around 3 years, then the pathogen will evolve and it will overcome this resistance. So then all of a sudden, you're going to start to see these leaf lesions, or infected flowers, pod infection, and of course, crown canker. On the flip side, if you're growing a variety with quantitative resistance, what this means is you are still going to get these leaf lesions because your effective major gene isn't working. But when it comes to crown canker or upper canopy infection, then the amount of disease you're going to get is significantly reduced depending on the level of quantitative resistance in your variety, which is influenced by, indicated by your blackleg rating. But with the work that we've been doing in our current projects, we've now shown that quantitative resistance also does get overcome by the pathogen. This takes between 3 to 5 years, depending on your disease pressure. And again, the amount of disease that you're going to see at the leaves won't change, but the amount of disease that you'll see at the end of the year at the crown canker stage will have a big impact, and you'll start to see much more disease. And this is why it is really, really important for you to be monitoring your disease year in, year out. So get out of the tractor, or if you're an agronomist, go out to the paddocks at windrowing, pull up 20 plants, cut them at the crown, and have a look at the amount of disease you've got. If you are seeing this level of disease in those bottom pictures, you are getting yield loss from blackleg. But if it's much less than that, or like the top pictures, then you're not, and what you're doing is perfectly fine. The plant can tolerate around 30% crown canker before you'll see any yield loss, which means that you can allow some disease in before you have a yield impact. And this is why we don't need to be putting fungicides on all the time, because we know the genetics is good enough that it's stopping enough of that disease, and the plant can tolerate enough of the disease that you can have some in there and it's not going to have any yield impact on your crop. So as a last resort, we then have the fungicides. As Nola said, these are not an insurance policy. One of the questions we got sent in at this through registration was that we've been harping on about not putting on a fungicide at the 4 to 6 leaf stage, and yet this year we've come out and said, hey everyone, get out there and spray. Now, the reason for this is because this is the year you want to have those fungicides up your sleeve. Because the conditions are so conducive to blackleg, because a lot of people have been growing the same pioneer lines for multiple years, so their quantitative resistance has eroded, and so now all of a sudden we've got a massive issue. We want to be able to use those fungicides. If we are using them year in, year out when we don't need them, you're going to create the resistance that Nola was talking about, and then you're not going to have them available for a year like 2026. So it is extremely important that you are always monitoring your crop, only putting a fungicide out when it is necessary, not as an insurance policy. And so I hope that for the person who did submit that question, that sort of clears up why we have been harping on so much about don't put it on normally, but having it up our sleeve so that this year, when we need it, we've got it there to use. So the decisions for this year. Now, obviously, for a lot of the crops over in WA, you are past the vegetative stage, but I thought I would just put some slides in for those who may not be. Essentially, as I mentioned, for a lot of regions, we've had perfect conditions for blackleg, but also perfect growth. So those two things are good and bad. It means that the plant can outgrow the pathogen, but also it means that if you keep getting those infection events, then if you're flowering earlier, then you're going to be then under threat for upper canopy infection, for example. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing that erosion of genetic resistance in many of our cultivars. So those pioneer lines that really have been used widely for the last 3 to 5 years, they're high yielding, they've been great, but this year there is going to be a price to pay for having stuck with those cultivars, unfortunately. So as I said, this is why we really are pushing fungicides. Might have been needed in 2020, well, will have been needed in 2026, at least in the east. Down the bottom here, this is the normal level of disease we would see at 4 to 6 leaf. If we see that, we would not be putting on a fungicide. That is not high disease pressure. On the right here, this is the level of disease that we've been seeing throughout Victoria, which has been why we've been saying get out there and spray and protect these plants from crown canker, because we're seeing huge amounts of disease. And as I mentioned earlier, this was back in June. So this is extremely early on in the growing season. So if you are still at the vegetative stage, up to 6 leaf stage in WA, you're thinking about a fungicide, you need to go out, see how much disease is in there, think about how long you've been growing the same variety for, and then that will help you determine whether or not you need to put a fungicide on. But for most people, it's now time to make a decision around upper canopy infection. Again, as I mentioned, perfect conditions. And like I said, we had that much earlier sowing, which has led to earlier flowering. Now, the big thing with upper canopy infection is that the disease needs enough time to get inside the plant, colonize, and start to cause damage before harvest, see a yield loss. So from the work we've been doing, what we know is if you're getting infections in July, you are in a high-risk situation. That is plenty of time for the disease to get in there and take hold. If you're in August, it sort of does depend on the season. We're doing a lot of work now around the country. We're monitoring 30 paddocks each year and trying to work out sort of for each region where this cutoff is. But for August, it's sort of early August, we would be saying still put a fungicide on if you need it. Late August, we're probably saying you don't need it. The fungus is not going to have enough time to cause too much yield loss, or if any. And by September, you're definitely not going to see yield loss from any infection. So when considering whether or not you need to put on an upper canopy infection, you need to think about what time of the year it is. At the moment, we're still in early August. So if we are, if there is forecast for a lot of rain still, then there might still be need for an upper canopy spray. But as again, Geoff alluded to, you guys don't have any rain forecast. We've got another 60 mil forecast for this weekend over Saturday and Sunday. So we've still got people going out and spraying, but over there you may not need to. And you also want to make sure you're thinking about your other diseases. So sclerotinia, as you know, pain in the ass to control. The difference with sclerotinia is that you have to be proactive. So you can't wait for sclerotinia to come in and then spray. So you really need to be thinking about what blooms you're at, how much leaf moisture there is, and what your previous history of sclerotinia is around making a decision as to whether or not that spray at 30% bloom is going to help you for sclerotinia. But blackleg, on the other hand, the fungicides often do give curative effect as well, which means you don't want to spray too early. So, we're now at the start of August. If there was rain forecast for in the next 2 weeks, you could probably wait another week or so to get you to that 30% bloom spray. Put it on, it's going to clean up any disease that was in the crop, and it'll give you that extra protection that will cover you for the rest of August. So just having a think about how long your protection needs to be, keeping in mind the fungicides can be curative for blackleg, and then whether or not you really need to be looking at controlling that sclerotinia. Lastly, obviously when selecting our fungicides, we really need to be thinking about fungicide resistance. So again, reinforcing what Nola was talking about, we know that we have pretty wide scale resistance to the DMIs. Now, this is actually a tolerance. It's not a complete resistance. So that means that many of the actives will still have some efficacy, but not as good as they used to be before this resistance cropped up. So how I like to think about it is it generally means that they wear off quicker. So if you used to have 3 weeks protection from tebuconazole, then maybe you only have a week and a half, for example. We know that prothioconazole is the best of the actives against this resistance, then flutriafol, and then your tebuconazole and fluquinconazole are pretty much equal, and they aren't very good at giving protection when you've got this DMI resistance. There is currently no cross resistance to the Revusol, the new DMI active that's registered for blackleg. We also know that we have SDHI resistance on the Eyre Peninsula, and at the moment that's where it has stayed. Again, this is different in the sense that it's complete resistance. So that means all Group 7 actives that are registered will not work where you have this resistance. We're doing a lot of monitoring to look for SDHI resistance everywhere else. And so we will be sending back data in the coming months to anyone who did submit stubbles. And at the moment, we have no QI resistance detected across Australia. So when selecting those fungicides and determining when to put on a fungicide application, we want to make sure we're rotating those actives, as Nola said. We want to avoid those back-to-back applications of the same active. Make sure you consider your timing. You don't, are you too late for crown canker? Well, then you don't want to be putting on at 10th leaf because that's not going to give you any help. Or are you too early for upper canopy infection, for example? And also consider how long you require that protection for, because that will influence whether or not you go for the newer products that'll give you a longer longevity versus the ones that we've got the compromised resistance. So hopefully that gives you some answers around fungicide decisions for blackleg. It'll be interesting to see what does pan out, because if it doesn't rain, whilst that means there won't be any new infections, we do know that with blackleg, a drier finish can mean that you don't need as much disease to have a yield impact. So it'll be interesting to see how things pan out, Belinda.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ange. So thank you to our speakers. We'll now open it up for questions and answers. But I will say we did work really hard to make sure that our presentations covered the range of questions that you submitted through the registration process. So please feel free to jump into the Q&A and put any other questions in. If not, I've got a few which I'll throw open to the team, and I'll start with one that has come through the chat. So that is, what diseases would you predict in coming summer in WA and eastern states? So I might throw that open to the team. Who'd like to take that one? Go on, Geoff.
Okay. What diseases would we predict? I'm assuming over the question is saying what diseases do we predict will come out of this summer into next year?
Yes.
It's a little bit of a how long's
been crystal ball there.
But having said that, every year all of those stubble-borne diseases, so the blacklegs, the net blotches, the yellow spots, are there every year because we have stubble every year. So those are a given that the inoculum will be present every year because we've produced it this year. So they are the driver there. They are a situation that exists every year, that stubble-borne disease is there. And then obviously what else happens depends on the lead into the season. If we have a green bridge leading into the season or regrowth leading into the season, then maybe the barley leaf rust down on the Esperance coast is going to continue to be a difficulty in the coming season. Or there's green material which hosts green peach aphid, which Ben Congdon will talk about, turnip yellows. So there's the stubble-borne diseases and sclerotinia, because the sclerotia in the stubble are there all the time. But some of these other diseases will be dependent on what the actual summer-autumn period gives us in terms of what we see next year.
Thanks, Geoff. One for you, Ange. And the question says, are we sleepwalking into resistance issues with prophylactic fungicides for sclerotinia in canola? What are your thoughts, Ange?
Yeah, so yes and no. So we don't know much about sclerotinia in terms of fungicide resistance. That's something that we are starting to do some work on to look at, to see, do we have resistance out there? Who knows? No one's looked. The big thing, of course, with those sprays, if you're putting on a spray for sclerotinia, keep in mind that is also going to have an impact on blackleg, because blackleg is still going to be there. And it goes the other way too. If you're putting on a spray for upper canopy infection, then that's going to have some selection towards sclerotinia. And so I think this is a big thing when it comes to fungicide resistance, regardless of the pathogen you are controlling. You need to keep in mind that these fungicides are generally having control on any other pathogen that's there, whether you're looking at cereals or pulses or canola. And so when you're talking about fungicide resistance, you really do need to have that in mind. And that is why we should be rotating those chemistries, using mixtures, and only putting these fungicides out when we need to and not constantly.
Thanks, Ange. While we're on that topic around mixing and rotation of actives, I'll throw it open to the team. Here's another question that came through. This one says mainly around the rotation of actives, and if we are putting too much pressure on Prof and Teb. What are your thoughts on this one?
Nola, did you want to do that one?
I'll do a quick one. I would definitely say if you, especially in the group 3s, because we find cross resistance within the group 3s, it can be variable with those particular actives. So if you're mixing them and you're constantly rotating between those, then you're reducing that fungicide pressure, basically. So yeah, definitely, if you keep using them, you keep using those same ones, then you are definitely going to increase that fungicide selection pressure with the diseases against those. So yeah, we just always highly recommend to mix and rotate them, even within the group. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you, Nola. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please drop them into the chat. We have, and I think we've got 3 more minutes, so we can take a few questions from the room if you would like to drop any in. While we see if anything comes from the floor, I have another one through the registration process. And that one's a bit more specific, so I might throw this one to Andrea. If a barley crop had an early Prosaro and requires a follow-up fungicide later in the season, what is the best option? Any tips or thoughts there?
Well, any of the registered products are going to do a good job. And so in light of the fact that Prosaro is 2 DMI fungicides, 2 group 3s, I'd suggest you rotate and look at one that's got a group 7 or a group 11 in it.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrea. And a more general one, and I think, Nola, you did cover this well, but just a few take-home tips. What do we need to consider from a fungicide resistance point of view? So what are the key take-homes which you want us to really have in our back pocket?
Key take home, use your varietal resistance first. Always think about what you're putting into the field because you're going to keep that disease pressure down right from the beginning. Also, before you think about fungicides, make sure you've got all your agronomic practices in play as well. So reduce your stubble, rotate your crops, reduce your green bridges, that kind of thing. Everything that you can do to reduce disease pressure right from the beginning is going to reduce the chance of you actually getting any fungicide resistance mutations within your diseases. And then when you do finally need to use those fungicides, use them strategically. Don't just go putting them on prophylactically, and mix and rotate. If that's the only thing you take home from today, is mix and rotate your fungicides to avoid fungicide resistance selection pressure.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So we might draw the panel discussion to an end. Just on behalf of the team, a very hearty thank you to our speakers today. We really appreciate you putting together all of the work. We have dropped into the chat a quick survey monkey, and we invite you to share your feedback on this afternoon's webinar. And we would just like to give a reminder that we are here to help. So if you have any other further questions or knowledge needs, please sing out to us and we'll chase up the information as we can. And also just a big thank you again to the GRDC for supporting the Disease Management Extension Network and to our partners. And again, a friendly reminder, we've tried to talk at that active level and to give you as many tactics as we can, but remember to seek your own advice relevant to your own farming system. So thank you again sincerely, everyone, for joining us. To our speakers, Nola, and Andrea and Geoff, thanks so much for your time. Bridget in our team will be sending around a follow-up MailChimp with some links to further resources, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you all. Wishing you all the best for the season, and thanks again for joining us.